What in the mother-loving goat is he doing? Hey, aren't you supposed to be making holsters right now? What are you doing? What are you watching?
Oh, I'm just watching a PSR video.
Wait, watching what?
Oh, print, shoot, repeat. A video about slapping the MP5. I'm trying to perfect it.
I think that MP5s and their clones are on the verge of a resurgence among the civilian gun owner, and one of those reasons is cheap and affordable 9mm ammo. Now, speaking of cheap 9mm, the ammo provided for this video was brought to you by Armalux Defense Co. He reached out to me and he said, hey, I really like your channel, I like what you're doing, so you want some ammo for a couple shoutouts? And I said, sure. So he is the ammo sponsor for this video. If you want to go say thanks and show your support for, the channel, you can go buy from him. I don't make any money off of that. That just helps him as a way to say thank you, I guess, for sending the ammo to me. So thank you, Armalux Defense Company, for sending out the ammo so that we could go FRT with some of these MP5s. And let's get on with the rest of the video. Welcome back to the agency. Today I wanted to experiment with a different kind of video and do a little bit of Call of Duty commentary. I remember growing up, I used to watch a ton of Call of Duty commentaries, even if it wasn't about Call of Duty, but if it was just about different subjects. And I wanted to do that today with the subject of why MP5s are so popular, especially amongst the civilian market, because I feel like as soon as I got my MP5 clone, I started to see them everywhere. I don't know if that's a phenomenon, like when you buy a new car and all of a sudden you start to see it, everywhere you go, you start to see your car. It could be something like that, or it could be a genuine rise in MP5 clones in the market. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about that today. Not necessarily try and diagnose why it's happening, but almost why I bought the MP5 clone that I did. Now I got a Mac 5, which is kind of like the poor people one, but maybe if I kind of describe why I ended up getting into it, it can resonate with people and maybe it's similar reasons. So why did I get an MP5 clone? Well, it kind of boils down to two things. Nostalgia and affordability / availability. I think that our generation is very unique in the sense that we are very influenced by the media that we consume, as everybody has, but we're different than our fathers in the sense that, they would watch a movie, they would watch Dirty Harry, they would watch whatever, the A-Team, fill in your Rambo, Predator, all these movies, all these classics, they'd watch those, and they would be like, oh, that looks like a really cool gun, and then they go and they buy a, Smith & Wesson revolver, or they go buy, a Walther from James Bond, different things like that. Where our generation, I'm talking, I'm 27, so we're talking about guys born, I would say, early 90s to, 2005-ish. Guys within that generation, I think, have a very, almost a parasocial relationship with some of these guns, because it takes it a step further than just movies or TV shows and seeing those guns on screen. We almost have a parasocial attachment to them because we feel like we've used them. We've used them for getting kill streaks. You'll see people all the time say, oh, I remember using the AUG or the ACR. I got, 25 tactical nukes with the ACR back in the day. And they say this as a joke, but I think there's some sort of connection that you have. I don't know if your subconscious can really tell what's fake and what isn't. When you consume media sometimes, I think you can form nostalgia for guns that you have never even shot. That's why I like to do the cloning. That's why I like to do some of the stuff that I do on this channel, just because it's like, hey, I want to bring the stuff that I used for 10, 15 years on the digital world into the real world and see what it's like, practically speaking, in a real world sense. Of course, the MP5 has many benefits. I mean, there's a whole list of counter-terrorist units and military's police that have used this gun throughout the world because it's compact, it's lightweight, roller blade system is fantastic for recoil mitigation and everything like that. But so as far as the history of the MP5 goes, I did have some notes that I wanted to kind of go over because I think it's kind of important to appreciate not only the gun from a mechanical standpoint, but the history of it as well. H&K came out with the G3, I think it was 1956. They came out with the G3, 7.62 battle rifle that we all know and love. A few years later, they had Project 64, which was an attempt to bring the G3 into a couple different calibers. So you had the HK11, the HK21, the 33, and the 54. The 54 would live on to become the MP5, but that wouldn't be for a few more years. It was kind of a unique time in history because unlike the open bolt submachine guns of that era, like the Uzi or the Sterling, the MP5 was a closed bolt because after all, it was based off of that G3. On top of that, it was roller delayed. So if you're not familiar with the roller delayed system, I'm not really the guy to be able to explain that to you. There are some really good videos out here on YouTube that can show you that, but needless to say, it is better than a direct blowback system, and there's kind of these little rollers that delay, funny enough, right? Delay the bolt and kind of bear the initial recoil of those gases and the pressures before passing it on to the rest of the system and moving it rearward. Again, there's videos on that you guys can go look up. Many of you probably already know how it works, but I might even throw a graphic up on screen of how that kind of works. But moving along, so some of the first users of this MP5 were the West German Border Guards and the Bundeswehr Special Forces, and by 1966 it was officially designated the MP5. Now, skipping a few years ahead, we have to talk about Munich, 1972. It was the Olympics in Munich, and a group of Palestinians belonging to the Black September group attacked the Olympic Village. They initially went up and killed a couple of Israeli athletes, and then they took 9 more hostage. And when the German police attempted to rescue them, it was a botched operation. They didn't have the right training. There was a sniper team, but they weren't allowed to use them because of some weird German constitutional laws. So the whole thing was a disaster, and it resulted in the 9 Israeli athletes dying. And this kind of highlighted in Germany that, hey, we need to have maybe a special unit to deal with stuff like this. And instead of giving that to the military, they were kind of afraid of making another Nazi Germany situation. They ended up making a new special police unit known as the GSG-9. That only happened about 2 weeks after the Munich event. And eventually, these guys were equipped with MP5s, but the MP5 wouldn't taste blood until the Lufthansa Flight 181 hijacking a few years later in 1977. This was once again when some Palestinian militants hijacked a Boeing 737 and they flew it to Mogadishu, and the German chancellor and the Somali president worked something out so that GSG-9 could travel over to Somalia and storm the plane, and that's what they did. Stormed the plane, they killed the terrorist, and they rescued, I believe it was 87 hostages with very minor injuries to an operator and a civilian, and the terrorists were righteously defeated. And this was the first time that the MP5 had a taste of blood. And then famously, a few years later, the SAS in London used the MP5 with the streamlight torches, if you will, up top. And this was iconic for not only the SAS, but for the MP5, and it really broadcasted H&K's submachine gun to the world. And, before you knew it, you had counter-terrorist police, special forces everywhere around the world trying to get their hands on this. And the MP5 dominated for the next 40 years or so. It was even used a little bit in the GWAT. Jeff Gerwich of Modern Tactical Shooting talks about using MP5s in situations where they had to bring something better than a pistol, but not as large as a rifle, and discreetly carry that while they were doing operations in Iraq. So what about the civilian side of things? Well, in the 1980s, you had the H&K 94, which was a semi-automatic carbine version of the MP5, and that was specifically made for import for the U.S. market. And between 1983 and 1989, there was about 15,000 of these H&K 94s that were imported before the 1989 import ban ended up shutting the door on that, unfortunately. Mechanically, the HK 94 was different from the MP5 because it had a 16.5-inch barrel instead of the MP5's original 8.9-inch. There was a push-button magazine release with no paddle release. There was a 0 to 1 semi-automatic trigger group. A fun fact is that many of the MP5s that you see on screen in movies like Predator, Cliffhanger, and Die Hard are actually chopped and converted HK94s. Chopped meaning the barrel is cut. You can often tell that there's no tri-lug on those barrels in those movies, such as Die Hard, converted to full auto for the movie. There was a brief period as well where we had guns like the HK94 SG-1 sniper variant, and that was also marketed to civilians, but it was very expensive and it just did not sell well. And then of course you had the SP-89, which was a version of the MP5K for the civilian market as well, but that was very short-lived because of the 1989 import ban, and then later on the 1994 assault weapons ban, which completely halted civilian importation of foreign-made, non-sporting firearms. In 1991, there was a brief period where H&K did import 420 HK94s for California Department of Corrections, but those of course were not available to civilians. So if you were a civilian trying to get an MP5 clone at this time, you were pretty much SOL from 1994 to about 2015. There's forums I was reading about guys trying to go and get these things, but they had to find HK94s on secondhand market, and that wasn't really cheap because there was just so few of them out there. Now, all this changed for the better in the mid-2010s when Zenith started to import MP5s from MKE in Turkey. Now, those Turkish guns were built on original H&K tooling because at some point in history, H&K traveled to Turkey and they established some factories and some plants there to do some contract stuff and build H&K guns, whether it's for the Turkish military or maybe they were trying to get around some laws in Europe. Whatever the reason was, H&K had factories there and taught these people how to make MP5s. Eventually, H&K moved out of Turkey, back to Germany, and they started to build their guns, as I understand it, to a little bit of a different ecological standard. Whereas in Turkey, no standards existed, so they kind of remained cemented in the past. Some of these manufacturers are still building MP5s to the original specs. Of course, you're getting Turkish QC, so it's not going to be exactly the same. If you do get a good one like the AP9 or, those kinds of Century Arms guns, you're getting a very true to H&K 70s, 80s style of, MP5, which I think is really cool. The Zenith imports were the first widespread and affordable MP5 pattern guns that Americans could get their hands on in decades. And soon after that, PTR released their US-made PTR 9CT. Century Arms eventually followed with the AP5, and boutique builders like Dakota Tactical even offered some more premium and custom variants. Then, in 2019, H&K themselves came back into the civilian market with the SP5, which was a true semi-auto MP5. They saw the demand that people had for these guns, and they said, I think that we really have a market here, and they decided to release that gun, which we can all appreciate. So why is the resurgence? I think that nostalgia certainly plays a big factor. That's kind of what hooks you, I think. You're hooked by, hey, I remember this gun from insert favorite media. Or, maybe it's even, hey, this gun, I remember seeing it during the siege in London. Or I remember X, Y, and Z, seeing cool photographs of Navy SEALs rocking this. I've always wanted one. I've always heard good things. Whatever the reason was, whenever you do get your hands on an MP5, either an H&K or one of the clones, to appreciate the MP5 and to understand why it was so effective for so long. Granted, we only have semi-automatic versions, but when you do shoot it compared to AR9s or some of these other direct blowbacks, PCCs, it's very easy to understand why the MP5 was the king for so long. You can imagine, as good as it is in semi-auto, how much better it is on full auto, and it becomes very clear as to why this was the peak CQB gun, from the late 60s to the mid 2000s. Many things about the MP5, there's a lot of things to like, and there are a lot of things to not like. It is an antiquated system. It has a more complicated manual of arms. It's not terrible by any means. Once you understand it, it's very simple, but it does have a more complicated manual of arms that most people might not be used to, and it's hard to upgrade for night vision. To accessorize it in a modern capacity is a little more challenging than, it's not impossible by no means. I mean, there's good CAC rails out there, there's M-Lock now, there's all sorts of claw mounts that you can put it on top to put all your favorite, optics and whatever else you need. The main challenge comes from that charging handle and the placement of it. Traditionally putting, your tape switches and whatnot around the handguard, it's going to be a little bit different on an MP5 because the roll relay system requires that space to be free. So there are challenges to the platform, but I think there is a resurgence on the rise because of the affordability. There's so many affordable clones out there that are so similar to the original H&Ks that it's hard not to try one out for yourself. And 9mm is so cheap, why wouldn't you want to at least give it a shot? Most civilians, the threats that they may face may not be from a person with body armor. They may only need a pistol or a glorified pistol being the MP5. I think all those things play a factor into the MP5 resurgence, and additionally, the introduction of the FRT and now the widespread adoption of that amongst civilians is really, I think, going to take the MP5 to new levels, because now we are starting to appreciate the original design on a near full auto capability. I was shooting Hammy's SP5 with his FRT in it, and I'll tell you, that thing was a blast, and I can totally understand why that was the gun of HRT, Navy SEALs, SAS for as long as it was. It wasn't until guys started adopting body armor and these other things that it started to become more challenging, but I still think the MP5 has a place today, and I think it's only going to grow in popularity. Without further ado, I appreciate you guys sticking around and watching the channel, watching the video. I hope you guys got something out of it, and hopefully you can relate. Comment down below, the gun that you remember growing up that you ended up buying. For me, it was the MP5, among others, but, for this video, it was the MP5. I hope you guys like and subscribe, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.